Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. What are the steps the government needs to take to restore growth, revive investor sentiment and remove the clouds on the economic horizon? That's the key issue I shall discuss today with the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, after taking charge of the Finance Ministry, the Prime Minister spoke of reviving animal spirits, restoring investor sentiment and reversing the climate of pessimism. Does that mean that it's imperative for the government to act decisively and quickly?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what the Prime Minister meant, and I think that's what we should do.
And there's a hint here, is there not, that this is a serious situation?
It is true that for us to blame the world is totally wrong. There are lots of things domestically that needed to be corrected, and I think that's what we should concentrate on.
Let's then come to the key problems you face, one by one, and ask you what you think should be done about them. First, growth. Last year it fell to 6.5%, in the last quarter it fell to 5.3%, and clearly you need to revive animal spirits if you're going to get it back up to 8 and 9% levels. But in reviving animal spirits, how important is it to push through stalled reforms?
I think when you say animal spirits, what you really mean is the pace of investment must pick up. It is true that last year investment went down. Now, in order to get investment up, lots of things have to happen. One of them is pending reforms. A lot of it has to do with better implementation of existing projects which have got stuck and are in the pipeline. Some of it has to do with tax-related changes that the Prime Minister talked about. And I think taken all together, investors need to be reassured that the government is keen to promote investment, keen to attract investment, support domestic investors. I think all of these things need to be done.
Now, you mentioned 3 or 4 things over there. Let's take them one by one. To begin with, pending reforms. There are some reforms that the government can push through on its own by executive decision. I'm talking of FDI in retail, FDI in aviation. It's been talked about. Will it actually happen?
I think there are things that have to be done. Certainly FDI in retail, in my view, should be done. FDI in civil aviation should be done. But you know, reforms, everything that needs to be done is not a reform.
Let's not call it a reform.
A lot of it is just implementation bottlenecks being removed.
Let's not call it a reform, but you're saying these are 2 changes that should be done.
In my view, that's correct. And let me say, it's not just in my view. Government has said that they're going to do it. Now we just have to implement it, that's all.
Now, a second set of reforms that are dependent upon parliamentary legislation are reforms to do with insurance, banking, pension, GST, DTC. Those are stuck in Parliament. Will government be able to find a way, either through negotiation with the opposition or by reaching out to a multiple lot of parties, to push those through?
Well, I would certainly hope that government will reach out to all the stakeholders in order to build a consensus in Parliament to get the necessary legislative changes done. But let me say, by the way, I do not think that the deceleration of growth is because these reforms haven't been pushed through. I mean, please remember, we grew for 4 years at 9% with none of these reforms in place. I think that there's a lot that can happen if implementation bottlenecks in infrastructure, which are holding up investment, are actually removed. Now, none of this requires legislative changes.
Now, in fact, you talked about bottlenecks a moment ago, and that's another issue that I wanted to take up with you. Industrialists point out that there are a number of critical projects in the energy sector, coal, gas, power, that are held up because of unavailability of coal, because of problems to do with pricing, because of problems to do with the transmission or wheeling of power. Can that lot of problems be quickly tackled so that growth is not stalled as a result?
Absolutely yes. In fact, in my view, the highest priority for purposes of getting a quick change of investor mood must lie in overcoming these bottlenecks. The legislative changes are important, but they can come over a period of time. We can sort these problems out in 4 months' time, or at least we can create evidence that they're being sorted out, which will change the mood.
You really mean 4 months?
I mean that in 4 months' time, we can do enough that people looking back would say that during this period, a problem-solving mechanism has been put in place and things are moving.
Now, FICCI points out that something else that's holding back reform, despite the fact you have a new manufacturing policy, is that even today 66 clearances are required for a new venture to be up and starting. Can you cut through that paperwork?
You certainly can and should. But please remember, you grew for 5 years at 9%, needing 66 clearances. I think it's simply wrong to think that the slowdown is due to these factors. These are the next generation of reforms that we must do. It's not all us, it's the central government and the state government.
You began this bit of the conversation by talking about the need to step up investment.
Yes.
That was the critical factor to fire animal spirits.
Yes.
One of the things that has actually affected and dampened investor sentiment both at home and abroad is the government's tax avoidance proposals and what is in common parlance called the Vodafone hook. Can the government review and reconsider the tax avoidance proposals and somehow get yourself off Vodafone?
Well, there are two separate issues. I mean, there's the tax issue of Vodafone, and I don't want to comment on something that involves an individual company. The larger issue is what I call the general anti-avoidance rules, the GAR rules. A number of these were introduced. I think they have caused a lot of uncertainty among investors. The government actually recognized that by postponing the implementation of GAR, and what they said was that they were going to bring out draft guidelines which would reassure people. And in particular, this is the most important thing, I think the government has said quite often that FIIs should be reassured that this is not intended to make a prejudicial change in their tax situation. My personal view is that's the correct thing to do. Now, the GAR draft rules should reassure people. I believe 2 days ago, I think they've circulated something at the official level, invited feedback. These have taken care of some problems. I think the government should look carefully at informed opinion and informed comment on whether these rules take care of all the problems that are creating difficulty and then address them. It's a very important area. And it's not something new. We had already taken steps. Now we should carry those steps to a logical conclusion.
Now, I know you're reluctant to talk about Vodafone, an individual company, but you know as well as I do that it has worried investors to the point that George Osborne, Timothy Geithner have raised it. It's an issue that's worried Vodafone and other investing companies. Let me put this to you. Could the government conceivably come to a conclusion that because Vodafone was adjudicated and settled by the Supreme Court and then upheld on review, that this company will not be affected by the retrospective amendment in the tax law?
Well, you know, as I said, taxation matters are complex, and I don't want to pronounce on a complex matter, particularly when it relates to an individual company. So I think what I'm saying is that the concern that came up was not just because of Vodafone, though it's possible that the high-profile attention that Vodafone got complicated everything else. I'm talking about all the other things. Vodafone is an issue the finance ministry will have to handle.
One other question. Do you think it might be sensible for the government to give an assurance to investors that retrospective amendment of tax legislation, something that unsettles investors all over the world, will not happen hereafter?
Well, you know, my view is that retrospective amendments are highly, should be the rarest of things. I do want to say, by the way, and I think if you talk to any investor, they'll tell you, we are not the only country that occasionally does something retrospective. Other tax jurisdictions have done it, but very, very rarely. And I do think as a
we
general,
had 27 such in the last budget, I'm told.
No, but those, that's what I'm saying, those related to many other things.
Dr. Rangarajan said to me just 3 weeks ago that just because others have done it and got away with it is no reason for us to try it. We need to think carefully about doing these things in the future.
No, I agree with that.
You agree with that?
Absolutely.
All right, let's come to the second big problem you face, the fiscal deficit. Last year it came in at 5.7%, but would you accept that if you're going to actually bring it down to 5.1, it's absolutely critical that subsidies be capped at 2%?
Oh, that's correct. I mean, that has been government policy. That is the policy of the finance ministry. The previous finance minister, the prime minister has said we need to do this. There's no doubt about that.
If you're really committed to capping subsidies at 2%, would you then accept that diesel and LPG prices, and perhaps also kerosene, need to be raised both quickly and perhaps substantially?
You know, the view of the Planning Commission on this and the view of any economist on this is that diesel and LPG have to be aligned with global prices. You can keep in mind the need to subsidize really vulnerable individuals, certainly for kerosene, maybe for LPG, but otherwise it is not possible to run an economy if you're going to maintain substantial subsidies on diesel. Now, how you do it, when you do it, in how many steps, these are the issues.
But do it you must.
That would be my view, certainly.
Now, if we're really serious about that 5.1% fiscal deficit target, remember it's predicated upon a growth assumption of 7.6. Many people believe today 7.6 is perhaps unrealistic.
You're not going to get 7.6.
We're not going to get 7.6.
No.
You're absolutely clear about that.
I am. I mean, it's not a forecast that I'm making, but my own guess is, look, I think the best hope we have for the current year, given the slowdown that's occurred, the economy could grow somewhere between 6.5, 7, depending on what happens in the next 6 months. I don't think 7.5 is possible. We should assume growth will be lower.
All right, you're saying growth should be somewhere between 6.5 and 7. That's
Yes.
somewhere between half a percentage point or a full percentage point less than the target of 7.6, in which case, if achieving the 5.1% fiscal deficit target is important, do you accept expenditure has to be cut?
You know, globally, this treating the fiscal deficit target as a rigid target is not contemporary fiscal practice.
But are you saying you're
I'm
willing to accept
let me
a higher
explain,
fiscal
let me
deficit?
explain what I'm saying. Anytime a budget is made, a budget is always made on the assumption that growth will be something. And then variations in growth, it is assumed, will impact the fiscal deficit. If growth is less, in nominal terms, by the way, if growth is less than was projected, the chances are the fiscal deficit will worsen. If it's better, then the chances are it'll improve.
But you can still keep the fiscal deficit target even if growth is less, provided you reduce expenditure. That's what I'm actually
I'm not
asking.
sure that that is recommended, by the way. Most people say, let us determine what is the, you might say, structural fiscal deficit you want. And if growth is lower than that, you should accept a deterioration in the fiscal deficit.
So you're
That's
saying
what we're doing around the world.
You're saying to me there's no argument for cutting expenditure because the last budget in March kicked up expenditure by 22%. Gross borrowing requirement increased from 5.1 to 5.7 lakhs. You're saying there's no argument for reducing both.
I'm saying that we should continue with the fiscal deficit target of 5.1% defined as a structural deficit target. And if the growth is less than that, we should accept the fact that the fiscal deficit in the current year might worsen, and in the next budget we'll have to set a more appropriate target which offsets it.
The second deficit that worries people is the current account deficit. It's come in at an unprecedented 4.2% of GDP. Now I know steps that you take to improve investment will help balance the current account deficit, as well as the weakening of the oil price will help you. But beyond that, do you have steps in mind?
Well, there's a lot of talk on the deterioration of the current account deficit, so I want to clarify one thing. A very large part of the deterioration in 2011-2012 over the previous year was due to a huge import of gold. That import has choked off anyway. And I think that deterioration is less a development on the current account than a sort of a substitute for a capital outflow. Because when people are uncertain about the exchange rate in other countries, you see a capital outflow. In India, they buy gold.
So you're saying to me that because the gold import has been choked off, the
Yes.
current account deficit next year
It's
will
not
off
just
its own
it's
come
not
down.
just choked off. I think the expectation that the rupee will keep weakening is no longer there. If you remove gold imports from the accounting, the current account deficit in the first 3 quarters of 2011-2012 is pretty much the same as it was in 2010.
So in other words,
it's high, but it's the same.
So the message you're saying is that the current account deficit will, over a period of time, correct itself?
I'm saying that in 2012-2013, it will not be 4.2%.
Are you also saying by that same account that the slide in the rupee will slowly but steadily reverse itself?
Well, I never like predicting anything about exchange rate, but in my view, the weakening of the exchange rate has gone a little beyond what underlying fundamentals would suggest.
So these are two
and
areas.
therefore, I expect that not to happen.
So these are two areas, the current account deficit and the sliding of the rupee, where the government doesn't need to do too much because those are situations which are already correcting themselves.
Well, I would say that you always need to worry about the current account deficit, but I don't think it's going to be 4.2%. As you yourself said, oil prices have softened quite a bit. If they remain soft, then I think in the current year, 2012-2013, we will not have as big a deficit as we had last year. But the key thing is we'll still have a deficit. So we need the foreign inflows, FDI and FII, to finance.
And therefore, you need to ensure that the attitude of this government towards investment remains one that attracts investors rather than
Absolutely,
puts them
but the
off.
government has made that very clear. That is the attitude of the government.
Finally, what about inflation? It's stubbornly stuck above 7%. It seems to be the government's Achilles heel. What, if anything, can you do about it?
Well, I think what has happened with inflation is that a year ago the fear was double digit. It's not double digit, but it's still uncomfortable. It's sort of in the 7%, maybe a little bit below range. I would be happier if we could say inflation is in the 5 to 6% range. It isn't at the moment.
But are you also saying to me that there's not much we can do? We hope it will come down slowly from 7 to 5, but beyond that hope, there's not much we can do.
No, I wouldn't put that way. I mean, I think a lot of what needs to be done on the inflation front is keeping the macro under reasonable control, and I think that is under reasonable control. We will not have the pressure on commodity prices which we had in the previous year. So I think that'll be a softening effect on oil prices. And I think if we have a reasonable monsoon, given also that we have a pretty big food stock, I don't expect to see too much pressure on food inflation.
We aren't sure of a reasonable monsoon. There are fears it may not be reasonable, but let's leave that aside. Let's take a break and come back and talk about timelines. That's in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, in part one, you clearly sketched out what the government needs to do. And this has been known to everyone for quite a while. So why hasn't the government acted earlier?
Well, I think the government has started on many of the things that I talked about. I mean, let me give you two examples.
No, forgive me. Don't give me examples. Answer the public perception that for 6 or 8 months the government knew what it had to do and hasn't acted.
Well, I won't necessarily say that it hasn't acted, because in the whole area of infrastructure, let me say that a lot of stuff has been done to put in place a system that can start unblocking things.
The whole problem of GAAR was allowed to develop, particularly when you knew that the economy was slowing down. Why was that problem allowed to happen in the first place?
Well, you know, in our system, budgets are secret. As soon as the budget was presented, it was clear that GAAR was going to create a problem, and the previous finance minister postponed the application of GAAR by 1 year. That was a clear recognition that what had been put forward was not acceptable. Now, you know, there is a process. When you make changes, you consult. I hope they'll resolve this uncertainty very quickly.
Was the previous finance minister himself the problem? Many people are asking that question. You must have seen it in newspapers and on television channels. Let me ask you bluntly. Was the previous finance minister the problem?
No, I think this is something, you don't want to be carried away with. Newspapers are always trying to put one minister against the other. I mean, look, the art of taxation is difficult. I do believe that there were problems. You have to give credit to the previous finance minister that, after all, he postponed the application of GAAR.
Except for the fact that within 24 hours of Pranab Mukherjee resigning, course correction has started. The Prime Minister is using a different language. Animal spirits are suddenly being worried about. No longer is it the line of the Finance Ministry that the India growth story is intact. The Prime Minister says something different. So I ask you again, was Pranab Mukherjee the problem? Are you relieved he's gone?
I really don't think this is an issue that you pin on any one person. The India growth story, having slowed down, is not something that the previous finance minister was denying. I mean, the fact of the matter is if you look at the last 6 months, time and again, people have recognized and said that growth is slowing down. It's a matter of concern.
Oh, previously they denied there was policy paralysis. Now there's admission that there was. There's a change in language, even if it's a bit embarrassing for you to admit, and there's a change in action too.
You know, using terms like policy paralysis is good TV. It's not good policy making.
All right.
I mean, things happen, you take a corrective step. Let's see how it works.
Mr. Ahluwalia, let's see how it works, and let's keep our fingers crossed. A pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Charles.